medicine thing. I know the whole thing. They called me Captain NyQuil on the set because I drank so much of it because I was so sick. And every day on the set, I was like always like drugged up from this thing, and I didn't know it would affect me like that. And it's a thing that has alcohol in it.
There was a time when Hollywood could turn a shy teenager into a household name almost overnight. But in the case of Cory Haim, the story began long before the posters, the screaming fans, and the flashing cameras. It began with a boy who wasn't dreaming about Hollywood at all. He was dreaming about hockey. For anyone who grew up watching movies in the 1980s, Cory Haim's face is instantly recognizable. The untidy hair, the youthful smile, the nervous energy that made him seem less like a movie star and more like the kid sitting next to you in school. Decades later, that familiarity is what makes his story so difficult to revisit. Because behind that famous face was a teenager who entered an industry he barely understood, and an adult world that was far more complicated than the movies he made. Cory Haim was born in Toronto in December 1971. His childhood was spent between Canada and Quebec, and by most accounts, acting wasn't his first passion. Hockey was. Like countless Canadian kids, he dreamed of skating, competing, and perhaps one day making the sport his career. Acting entered his life almost by accident. His mother, Judy, enrolled him in drama classes because Cory was painfully shy and needed help coming out of his shell. It was supposed to be a way to build confidence, not the beginning of a Hollywood career. Then, while accompanying his older sister to an audition, something unexpected happened. Cory caught the attention of people in the business. Within a few years, the shy, hockey-loving kid was appearing in commercials and Canadian television. One of his early opportunities came with the Audition twins, which introduced him to professional acting while he was still barely into his teens. Then came a series of film roles, including Firstborn, A Time to Live, Secret Admirer, Murphy's Romance, and Silver Bullet. Each role gave him more experience, but more importantly, they revealed something Hollywood couldn't ignore. Cory Haim had a natural ability to make audiences believe they were watching a real teenager, not an actor pretending to be one. And that quality would soon make him famous. But before Hollywood turned Cory Haim into one of the most recognizable young stars of the decade, another film was waiting around the corner. A film that would change everything. Then came Lucas in 1986, and suddenly Cory Haim was no longer just another promising child actor. The film gave him something Hollywood couldn't manufacture, a character that felt painfully real. Lucas was shy, awkward, insecure, and desperate to belong. The kind of teenager many people over 50 can still remember from their own school years. Haim didn't simply play that loneliness, he made the audience feel it. The performance caught the attention of critics, including Roger Ebert, who singled Haim out as one of the year's standout young performers. But Lucas also came with a decision that would later seem significant. Haim had opportunities to appear in The Mosquito Coast and Stand By Me, two projects that would become important films of their generation. Instead, his management chose Lucas, giving the young actor the leading role and greater visibility. Then Hollywood changed his life again. In 1987, The Lost Boys arrived. On paper, it was a strange combination. Teenagers, vampires, comedy, horror, and rock and roll style. Yet somehow it captured the mood of an entire generation. Set against the California coast, the movie became more than a successful horror film. It became part of the visual identity of the late 1980s. Haim played Sam Emerson, the younger brother who slowly realizes that something terrifying is hiding beneath the surface of his new town. His performance was funny, vulnerable, and completely relatable. And there was another young actor beside him who would become inseparable from his career, Corey Feldman. The two had known of each other before, but The Lost Boys changed everything. Their chemistry was immediate, and audiences loved seeing them together. Hollywood had found a marketable pair, and the press quickly gave them a name that would follow them for years, the two Corys. Suddenly, Cory Haim wasn't simply a successful young actor, he was a teenage celebrity. License to Drive followed in 1988, bringing Haim and Feldman together again. Then came Watchers, Dream a Little Dream, and eventually Prayer of the Roller Boys. Movie posters, magazine covers, interviews, screaming fans. The machinery of teen fame was running at full speed. By the time Haim reached the end of his teens, he had become one of the faces people associated with 1980s youth culture. From the outside, it looked like the perfect Hollywood dream. But behind the cameras, the the story was already beginning to change. For a teenager who had spent years working in front of cameras, growing up was never going to be simple. Cory Haim had become famous before he had the chance to discover who he was without Hollywood telling him who he needed to be. And when the audience moved on, he was left trying to figure that out in public. The late 1980s had made Haim and Corey Feldman a phenomenon. But the same industry that had once called them the future had very little patience for young stars who were getting older. By the early 1990s, the phone stopped ringing as often. The big studio projects became smaller productions, and the leading roles that once seemed guaranteed became increasingly difficult to find. At the same time, Haim was dealing with problems that had begun years earlier. He later spoke openly about being introduced to alcohol and marijuana while still very young, during the period when he was making Lucas. What may have started as something surrounding him gradually became something much harder to escape. That made the loss of his career momentum even more dangerous. Acting had been more than a job. It had been his entire identity since childhood. Now the structure that had surrounded him was disappearing just as his personal struggles were becoming more serious. Still, Haim kept trying. He appeared in films such as Fast Getaway IE, Dream a Little Dream 2, Demolition High, and Snowboard Academy. These projects kept his name in the credits, but they were far removed from the cultural impact of The Lost Boys or License to Drive. In 1997, at only 25 years old, Haim filed for bankruptcy. Yet he wasn't ready to give up on Hollywood. He explored music, attempted to record an album in Germany, and even auditioned for the role of Robin in Batman Forever. He didn't get the part. Each rejection seemed to push him further from the world that had once made him famous. Then, in 2007, something happened that briefly brought the past back. Haim and Feldman reunited for The Two Corys, an A&E reality series documenting their complicated friendship. For longtime fans, seeing the pair together again was nostalgic, but there was something uncomfortable beneath that nostalgia. The two boys America had watched grow up were now adults, carrying years of unresolved damage, and Haim was still fighting to find his way back. His next chapter would become the most painful one of all. By the time Cory Haim reached the end of his life, the boy who once seemed destined to rule Hollywood had become almost invisible to the industry that had made him famous. In March 2010, Haim died in Burbank, California, at just 38 years old. The official cause was pneumonia, with heart conditions also contributing to his death. There was no final comeback, no triumphant return to the big screen, only the quiet ending of a life that had once been lived almost entirely in front of cameras. What makes his story especially painful is how young he was when everything happened. Haim had spent his childhood becoming famous, his teenage years becoming a celebrity, and much of his adulthood trying to escape the problems that came with both. His final years were marked by financial difficulties and repeated attempts to rebuild his career. Even his reunion with Corey Feldman on The Two Corys became less a celebration of nostalgia and more a reminder of everything the two men had survived. And yet, more than 16 years after his death, people still remember Cory Haim. In 2026, nearly 4 decades after The Lost Boys, the film remains a cultural touchstone, while its surviving cast members continue to follow very different paths. Corey Feldman, born in 1971 like Haim, is now 55 and has continued working in acting, music, and documentaries. In recent years, he has remained publicly connected to the story of his childhood and his friendship with Haim. His marriage to Courtney Ann Mitchell ended in divorce in 2026, while his career continues to move between music, television, and film. That contrast is impossible to ignore. One of the two Corys is still here, still talking, still working, while the other remains frozen forever at 38. But perhaps the greatest mistake would be to remember Cory Haim simply as another fallen child star. He wasn't just the troubled teenager from the headlines. He was the awkward kid in Lucas, the frightened younger brother in The Lost Boys, the charismatic teenager in License to Drive. He made audiences laugh, feel, and remember what being young once felt like. And maybe that's what remains after all these years. Not the headlines, not the scandals, not the money he lost. The movies. Because Cory Haim may have disappeared from Hollywood long ago, but every time someone presses play on one of those old 1980s films, that nervous smile comes back to life. For a few hours, the boy who wanted to play hockey gets to be young again. And perhaps that is the part of Cory Haim's story worth remembering most.